Hi everybody and welcome to our webinar analysing and unravelling some of the results from Monday's Israeli election. My name's Getreu. I'm the Executive Director of the New Israel Fund in Australia. I want to first of all start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we here in Sydney are meeting on, which is the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respect to their elders past and present. I also will apologise for my croaky voice. I seem to have caught something. Thanks, Dahlia. Thanks for that vote of confidence. Our wonderful guest tonight is Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin, who is one of the go-to people of the, I think, diaspora and global media around what's happening in Israel, and of course within Israel as well. She's a very sought-after political consultant and analyst. She was here for Limud Oz in Melbourne maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I want to say.
2014, just before the war.
There you go. Okay. And she wowed the crowds and impressed a great number of people. So it's wonderful to have you back in Australia, albeit virtually. A lot of people are starting to join the webinar now, so welcome to you. Thanks for joining us. I wanted to start, I'm just going to go through some of the results of the election and talk a little bit about some of the things that have happened, on Monday. And then after that, we'll get into some discussion with Dahlia. If you'd like, you can ask a question by clicking on the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can also leave a comment if you're watching on Facebook Live, which hopefully is working. You can also tune in on, you can leave a comment there, or you can also at us on Twitter in order to keep the conversation going. So I'll start just by looking at some of the results. As you can see, Likud, Benjamin Netanyahu's party, got the most number of seats with 36, followed by the main opposition party, Blue and White, led by Benny Gantz, which got 33 seats. The next biggest party, I'm sure we'll be talking a lot about them tonight, is the Joint List, made up of Arab parties, mostly Arab representatives. There's one Jewish member on one of the lists that make up the Joint List with 15 seats, 2 more than in the last election. Shas, the Sephardi ultra-Orthodox party, received 9 seats. Yisrael Beitenu, the party of Avigdor Lieberman, has 7 seats. The amalgamation of Labour, Gesher and Meretz received also 7 seats, which is down on their representation from the last election when they ran separately. United Torah Judaism, the so-called Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox party, received 7 seats, and Yamina, finally the party of Defence Minister Naftali Bennett, received 6 seats. That's as of earlier this morning. I don't think we can expect the seats to shift all that much. One of the things I thought would be interesting to do is compare how the seats have travelled in the last few elections. Obviously, there were 2 elections last year, as well as one from 2015. So as you can see, the Likud has slightly lost ground between 2015 and now, but has actually gained back some of the loss that they made from the September election. The Blue and White Party have stayed the same as their September result. As I said, the Joint Arab List is up a couple of seats. The biggest decrease, though, definitely, is the combination of Labour, Gesher and Meretz. At the 2015 election, Labour, of course, ran as part of the Zionist Union conglomerate, and they've gone down now from 29 seats down to 7. So that is a really big jump. You can see, if you think about them in blocks, the right-wing religious nationalist bloc, the centre, and we can maybe talk a little bit about just how centrist or left the Blue and White Party is, the centre and left parties, the Arab parties, and then, of course, Avigdor Lieberman, who, even though he is ideologically very right-wing, has not been in the pro-Bibi camp for the last few elections. He has become a bloc on his own. So you can see that over the last few elections, things have come up and down a little bit. Maybe the right-wing bloc lost a little bit of ground in 2019, gained a little bit back. And it's interesting to think also, like you can see again, the Joint Arab List has increased their representation by half since April's election. One of the things I wanted to mention was something that happened just yesterday in the as part of the post-election machinations was Benjamin Netanyahu got up and as Anshel Pfeffer, who's a friend of NIF Australia, he came out here last year for NIF. He wrote that Netanyahu has gone peak racist by claiming that the opposition is subverting the will of the people, because he says his bloc, the Zionist bloc, won 58 seats on the right, and the Zionist bloc won 47 seats on the left, totally excluding the 15 seats from the Arab list, as if to say maybe that democracy is fine as long as it's only a Zionist democracy, and actually we don't count. When it comes to forming government, he wasn't even considering the representation of Arab citizens of Israel. One of the things we might talk a little bit about also with Dahlia is the total turnout and the changes that have happened over the last 7 years or so. You can see this election was the highest turnout of the 3 elections that we've had in this block since 2019, where it's increased from about 68% to about 71%. But most notably is the percentage turnout of the Arab party, from the Arab sector, which has created a boost for the joint Arab list. So it's interesting to see that from a little bit of disenfranchisement or disenchantment, I should say, in April of last year, that maybe the success of the joint list kind of was able to be built on with this election. So we're going to talk a little bit now with Dahlia Scheindlin. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and go back to talking to Dahlia. So maybe, Dahlia, you can kind of kick us off with some of the thoughts on how things have progressed so far.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And for once, it's reversed. Usually I'm doing this at night with a bunch of people on the East Coast in the US. And so I really appreciate the effort you make to be on at night and at your end. What I thought I would do is try to contextualize a little bit of how we are seeing what these results mean, because Liam kindly took over the explanation of the results. But I do think that it's worth explaining how they are being described and understood in Israel, and giving a more contextualized and I think more accurate approach. And then we'll talk maybe a little bit about some of the scenarios for what could happen, what kind of government might be formed or won't be formed, and then we can go into some moderated question and answers and then open question and answers. So I think the first thing to keep in mind is that Netanyahu right away on Monday night declared himself the winner. He portrayed this as a huge historic victory. He said it was no less exciting than the victory in 1996 when he first became prime minister. And he touted it as a great victory for the right religious, or what he calls the national camp. I think that it's worth essentially blowing that argument out of the water. First of all, that was based on initial projections that the right-wing bloc of the Netanyahu loyalists, this is important to distinguish, there are other right-wing parties, or at least one other right-wing party, but the bloc of Netanyahu loyalist right-wing parties did not get 60 seats. Even that would not have been a majority, but in fact they only got 58 seats, which is still leading over the other side without Lieberman, right? Because Lieberman is kind of in the middle on the coalition politics. And without that, even the center left and the Arab parties together still have somewhat less. Likud did win 3 seats more than blue and white, but as your graph pointed out very well, the pro-Netanyahu loyalist right-wing bloc actually lost seats over the course of 2019. If you add Lieberman, because he does belong on the right ideologically, and there should be no question about that, in fact, the result is identical to April, when the right-wing ideological bloc won 65 seats. And this brings me to a longer-term point, which I've written about and I continue to try to unpack, which is that despite the fact that Israel, we have this image of Israel as moving inexorably to the right. If any of you have heard me speak before, you may have heard me talk about how young people, especially young Jews in Israel, are more right-wing than older people, which would have led us for years now to imagine that the public would become more right-wing over time, because that started happening about 10 years ago. And yet the right-wing parties don't seem to be able to increase their vote share over the course of a decade. The last time they had higher vote than 2019 was 2015, when they won 67 seats, and it's been downhill from there. And election after election this year has not managed to change that. And even that is not the peak. The peak of right-wing ideological parties was back in 2003 when they had 69 seats. So in a strange way, their electoral share has been declining, even though the population seems to be theoretically moving more right-wing. And that is something that requires explanation. It's something that I think about and I'm constantly trying to answer to myself. The other important thing to remember is that when it comes to the Netanyahu way of life, way of governance, the way he has been governing, not just in terms of what he has said over the last 10 years and his populist nationalist style, his racist statements that we've seen, at an accelerating pace, including just last night, but also what he's done, the kinds of government that he's built, the legislation that he's had passed over the years, the erosion of democratic norms. 52% of voters voted against that. And for the purposes of this, I do include Lieberman in the anti-Netanyahu camp, because ever since the negotiations collapsed after the April elections, anybody who knows anything, any voter who knows anything about Avigdor Lieberman, even if they only know one thing, it's that he wants to take Netanyahu down, and that he had committed himself to not going into a government led by Netanyahu in this situation, with a thin guise of also wanting to draft the ultra-Orthodox, which I think that was never really as prominent a reason in the voters' minds. But the vote for Lieberman and anybody else outside the loyalist bloc is an anti-Netanyahu vote. I do think that we've had personal elections for a long time. Certainly Netanyahu has been a cult of personality for a long time. But as I read public opinion in this election, it was much more about Netanyahu, yes or no. And the majority of Israelis said no. That, by the way, is a very consistent breakdown. The roughly 52 or so percent who voted against him, to every survey testing any kind of question that deals with support or opposition to Netanyahu. So whether it's a question about, do you think he can continue being prime minister under indictment? Do you want him to continue being prime minister in general? Is he suitable to be prime minister? You always get about 42 to 45% of the Israeli public who supports him, and about 52% who oppose him. So this is a real trend. It's not an election fluke or a one-time thing. The majority have not chosen, have voted against Netanyahu. The other thing that's, I think, worth contextualizing about Likud's success, such as it is, because they did still increase their vote share, certainly from the September elections, and to a very small extent from the April elections, is that everything Netanyahu tried to do to prove that he was the country's best leader failed. In other words, it worked for the base. People kept supporting him. But his numbers did not change. They were rock solid throughout the entire election campaign period, throughout the announcement of, the Trump plan together with the White House, even when he went to, liberate the martyred Israeli who was languishing in a Russian prison on behalf of all of us because she needed to smuggle 7 grams of hash into the country, and went to Uganda and started conversations with, Sudan. All of those did not change the surveys at all. And his annexationist plans and bringing sovereignty / annexation into his stump speech, nothing made a difference. The only thing that he did that finally caused the poll numbers to change just before the end and put Likud a little bit ahead was an aggressive field get out the vote campaign. He just basically dragged the kinds of people who don't normally vote out of their homes, which is very shrewd campaigning. There's nothing like personal contact with the voters, and there's nothing like getting your votes out, getting the vote out to do it. But it wasn't about a ringing endorsement for what he promises. And that's worth noting. I think that's the basic context. And then in terms of what this means, all of the analysts for the first 2 days said, well, basically, even if it's not a resounding victory, Netanyahu is certainly in the stronger position to be called upon to form the next government. When we thought it was 60 seats, it looked like a shoo-in. He just needed one more MK to either defect or somehow, join the government. Then the numbers went down to 59 seats and the analysis didn't change, but then 58 seats makes it a little bit harder. It's psychologically, it's going to be more difficult to get 3 additional votes to top up a majority government. But still, having said all of that, and given that Likud did come in the biggest party, not just by 1 or 2 seats, but by 3 seats, which I've always thought was the kind of cutoff for what looks like a substantial lead, I still think he's in the best position to be called upon to form the next government. And largely because Blue and White and Lieberman have sworn up and down that they would never even consider a government with a joint list, making it almost impossible to think of reaching a majority government among the the opposition parties to Netanyahu. Maximum, there's potential for a minority government. I've gotten a lot of questions about what that would mean, but I think we need to start with what looks like kind of a default, which is that Netanyahu is probably in a better position to be asked to form the next government. The main way he can do that is by appealing to defectors from the opposition bloc. There's two kinds of defectors. One are individual MKs who can be peeled off if he can convince them. However, Israeli election law and the law of the Knesset is heavily against this. The law makes it very difficult for individual defectors and places political sanctions on them for doing so. So they discourage that. The other way to do it is to get a faction within one of the many amalgamated parties. So a pre-existing party that joined with some of the other parties, like Labor Meretz, Gesher, or the Joint List, but probably not them. More likely one of the factions within Blue and White to peel off, and there are no legal sanctions for that if you are an existing faction, and simply join the right-wing pro-Netanyahu government. The other option is some sort of a national unity government with Blue and White, although the way it looks now, it's hard to imagine all of Blue and White agreeing to that because they have very significant anti-Netanyahu forces within them. But it's an option that's out there. The other option is that Lieberman, through some sort of tough negotiation and demands for significant concessions, finds his way back to his natural ideological home. And I would say the least likely, but still final option is a minority government formed with Blue and White, Lieberman, Labor Gesher Meretz, with one vote of confidence from the Joint List, giving them a majority to swear in that minority government, and then maybe spending a year thinking about how to create a bigger government, add parties, and reach a majority government. That seems very unlikely right now. However, all of these scenarios are rife with pitfalls. And when I listed them in order of likelihood, the order in my mind changes. You know, I'd like to say daily, but over the last 2 days, it's changed hourly. So keep that in mind. I'll stop here and let Liam take on, ask me some questions about specific issues of interest.
So let's maybe start a little bit with Bibi, given that that was so dominant in your framing, in your context, and what, if this whole election was about being, are you kind of in Bibi's camp or you're not in Bibi's camp, what's the impact of in, 12 days from now when Netanyahu's trial is supposed to begin, which could well be the day that Rivlin calls him up and says, you've been given a majority of votes in order to form the next government. How does that play out? I mean, if his numbers have not changed at all in the last year, like you said, there's kind of a very solid, stable block of people who support him, despite a pending indictment, then an officially filed indictment, and now a trial beginning in a couple of weeks. Is that a game changer? Does that have the potential to be a game changer, or do we just expect much of the same once he starts sitting in court?
I don't see how it can be a game changer considering that the elections are over. I thought it might be a game changer because for the first two election cycles, there was the fear of him reaching this moment. There was an expectation of him being indicted, and I thought, it becomes a different matter when he's formally indicted and there's a court date set. And even people who think that he's being unfairly persecuted by the political forces acting upon the judiciary, I think that some small portion of them would have had significant doubts and would have preferred for somebody else to be prime minister while he's going through this. It doesn't seem to have been the case. He managed to get more voters out from his base, and they weren't deterred by that. And at this point, there's nothing the voters can do, even if I think everybody will realize that they really hate the optics of it. I think that it will become clear once they see him going to court. But by that time, the voters don't have a say anymore. Having said that, we should observe that over the last 24 hours, Blue and White has proposed that the entire 62-seat opposition bloc pass a law once the Knesset is sworn in, which the Knesset is sworn in the day before his trial, and that they should pass a law, saying that a prime minister or a member of Knesset who's under indictment cannot be tasked with forming the next government. At this moment, as we speak, there's a sort of emergency call-in with the Israel Democracy Institute, some of their best experts there, for whom I have great respect, to discuss many of these things. And I have to say that I do not have the benefit of their top legal expert analysis, and I'm not a lawyer, but I play one on TV. I'm just kidding. The point is, I've thought about this, and I do not support that law. I think that it is bad for a democracy to pass personal laws that are tailored to address one specific situation and have them go into effect immediately to influence that situation. That's the kind of thing Netanyahu would do. I don't think it's the kind of thing anybody who supports genuine democratic process should do. I have nothing against that kind of a law. I think that it can be passed and stipulated that it goes into effect after the next election cycle. But as I've always thought with relation to any law that I feel is intended to influence the results of elections.
Did I read that Netanyahu at one point had kind of signaled supporting such a law, 12 years ago when Ehud Olmert was maybe going to be in a similar situation?
I don't remember, but I wouldn't be surprised if he made some sort of a statement like that. A lot of times Netanyahu has a big gray zone between indicating support or even opposition to something, but in a way that's murky and doesn't really mean anything, makes a little bit of a headline and goes away and doesn't manifest in any more formal support for or opposition to things. So for example, he did the same thing just to give you an example of a murky opposition, when his governments have been debating a Supreme Court override law for years. And at one point there was a Haaretz story discussing it, and he said, oh, this is distorted and out of context, but he didn't actually deny supporting it. So he sort of indicated opposition to the headline saying this government is planning on passing this law, overriding the Supreme Court. But his protest against the headline didn't actually say that he was against such a law. So he has a way of kind of indicating what he thinks without actually committing himself to it. And I wouldn't be surprised if he did something like that with relation to Olmert. Of course, he made statements very clearly that Olmert must resign because he was under investigation. He wasn't even under indictment. So
I'll encourage people to ask their questions through Zoom, through the Q&A tab. You can type your question in. One of the ones that's come in so far is exactly what the president's options are. Rivlin made a statement, I think, as he was going to vote or on election day, saying that he felt like it was, I think, a great shame that Israel was going to a third election. He certainly didn't seem ecstatic at the prospect of having to go through this for a third time. What are his options going in if he doesn't think, all of which you outlined doesn't seem particularly likely or possible? It seems like a rerun of the last few elections. Is there anything that he can do to kind of break the logjam? Is there anything creative? One thing that our questioner has mentioned is that no party forms the government, but the Knesset runs as a government. I realize we're kind of getting into the legal, technical rather than the political, but if you had any thoughts on a way to break that logjam.
I mean, I don't think the president has too much leeway on this stuff. The president, of course, doesn't make laws or anything. He's a ceremonial president. He doesn't make or execute laws. He, I think, has taken an active role in previous rounds of negotiations by proposing his own kinds of program, plans for how, or compromise plans for how a unity government could be formed. He's taken an active role in that. And I have to say that on a personal level, I don't know him, but I think that it's long been communicated through people who do know him and work with him that he is kind of disgusted not only by what happened this year, but in general by Netanyahu's leadership. They were personal rivals inside Likud. Some people think that he really would have absolutely wanted Netanyahu out a long time ago, but he's kind of succumbed to the reality that he doesn't have any influence over this situation other than to bring a sort of moral force to either reaching a government reaching a government and doing what he can to help facilitate those negotiations. In terms of the question about whether the Knesset can function without a government, listen, the Knesset, of course, can vote on laws. They can. And, if you have a majority, and as everybody's noticing, I mean, Joint List or the Arab parties have voted with Likud on many things over the years. There's nothing to stop, 58 Netanyahu supporters from passing, innocuous laws, increasing the budget to the health ministry and getting support from the Joint List for a majority or any other party. and the vice versa. The opposition parties can pass laws about, I don't know, legalizing marijuana with support from Likud or Moshe Feiglin or whatever. But the point is, according to our, law of government, we have to have a government. We have to have an executive power. So people can suggest all they want that there is no government, but that would be a violation of a basic law.
So let's pivot maybe towards some of the parties that have done particularly well in this latest round. The most successful, probably, particularly in terms of expectations, was the Joint List. I think they had 13 in the last election. I know they were really hoping for 14 and 15 would have been a great result, and that's where they've ended up. At one point, it looked like even they were kind of on the precipice of 16, which would have really turned quite a few heads. Can you talk a little bit about where that boost came from as the first question? The second question is from one of our Q&As, which is how Ayman Odeh, the leader of their party, might take some strategic action in order to try and have more influence, whether that's by supporting the government, but from outside, at least that confidence motion. And could he barter anything from either Benny Gantz or Lieberman? What could he do, given that they are the third biggest party?
Yeah. Well, in terms of their success, again, in a way like Netanyahu, their big success came from really working very hard at turnout. But it's a little bit deeper than that in the recent history of the Arab citizens' voting patterns and interests and opinions and attitudes. The Arab public has been very clear for some years since I've done research among that community for years. They have long wanted their leaders to unify. And when that happened in 2015, right away we saw 13 seats. Then they broke up before April and went back down to 10 seats, got back together for September and got 13 seats. So there was already a sense of I think that there was a learning moment for the leadership when they realized, hey, we have to listen to our people, and our people are saying very clearly that they want us to get together. Our own political ideology just isn't as important if we actually want to have influence. So they listened, they did that for September. And then I think the success of that was notable and generated a sense of momentum and political empowerment among Arab citizens that by all accounts contributed both to enthusiasm for voting, but also diminishing interest in a voter boycott. There just wasn't that much uptake in September for let's sit out these elections, which there had been in April. And then by the March elections, there really wasn't in general any call for boycott. And if there were, they were really marginal. And so the idea of voting was much more legitimate and widespread among the Arab community, and the leaders put in a lot of legwork in the field to get out the vote. The other thing was, it's not exactly a nice feature of the system right now, but every time Netanyahu said something miserable and racist and incited against the Arab community, people got angrier and decided to go out and vote. So I think that certainly contributed to the sense of urgency among the Arab citizens. Of course, there's also a very interesting, developing enthusiasm among Jewish left-wing voters. And the reason we know this is because their vote share, as small as it is, rose from April to September and from September to March. So we're talking about small numbers, but each person who changes his or her mind to, from being a lifelong voter of Meretz or Labor to vote for Joint List is making an enormous psychological leap. I know this because every day friends of mine were calling to discuss this with me. B, because I was consulting for the Joint List, doing research into left-wing Jews and how to get them to support the Joint List during this campaign. And so the self-reported numbers did rise. We are now counting laboriously polling stations, but you can already see, it's a little bit of a ragged attempt to do data analysis because we have no way of knowing whether a voter is Jewish or Arab unless we can find any one ballot station where there are no Arabs. But there are very few. And we don't even know that because what we do have is a count of Jewish voters in particular ballot stations, but we don't know if the non-Jews are Arab. They could be former Soviet immigrants who are not listed as Jewish by the Ministry of the Interior. But having said that, when you see places like Ramat HaSharon and Ramat Gan showing 70% more or even 100% more, doubling the number of people who vote for joint list, even if it's like 10 to 20, that's people who never would have considered voting for an Arab party in the past. And that was a pattern that was seen across some of the, very obviously Jewish majority places. There's a long article about it, not long, actually, just a nice detailed article about it today in Haaretz. It's in Hebrew. I'm not sure if it's in the English yet.
It was in English, and they also spoke about it on the Haaretz Weekly podcast, which I highly recommend, where I think they also said that the vote share of the joint list in Bnei Brak went up like sevenfold from 6 votes to 24 votes or something.
They put up signs in Yiddish.
There you go.
I mean, the joint list, I think one of the important things to realize, and I take a teeny point of credit for this, is that I told the joint list that, that their message to the Jewish community, which was, by the way, not very different from their message to the Arab community. We know that the kinds of people who are interested are thinking along the same lines. I said it has to be a positive message, a message around, there is a path to a better future, a more equitable society, one with solidarity between the two communities, and a major statement against, racism and incitement. And it's not just about Arabs. It's about every community supporting one another and a sort of partnership. And they turned that into a very positive message of, a common future. And in order to break out of the image of being a sectoral party that represents only Arabs, they really did campaigns that were very reflective of exactly the message I was hoping they would, implement. And so they had signs in Yiddish and in Amharic, and they had, an ad saying, here's your Arabic lesson for the day, how to say common future in Arabic. And I think that these were very, very hopeful spots, and they communicated a very energetic and hopeful approach, which was one of the only positive campaigns, by the way. All the other campaigns were negative. So I think that is part of why there was growing interest among Jews. And again, most of the Jews I spoke to who said they were voting for joint list just said, I can't take the racism anymore coming from Netanyahu. It's not enough. It's kind of insufficient as a statement just to vote for labor merits.
So I found it fascinating. I was just in Israel last week, and I was also in Israel 12 months ago before the first of these set of 3 elections. And having been in Israel for election periods before as well, I think this was the first time I saw huge banner ads for the joint list around central Tel Aviv, volunteers handing out stickers, handing out information about how to vote for the joint list in the middle of Tel Aviv, which I thought was pretty extraordinary. Which takes us to one of the questions that's come through in our Q&A, which is whether you think there's any possibility of a left of center bloc taking government and returning into government without a partnership between Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel. Is there any future? Is there any realistic future for the left in Israel unless it's both Jewish and Arab?
No. I mean, there is no such thing as Israeli society without Jewish-Arab partnership at all, in my reading. It's not even a matter of left or right. If you can't figure out how to build a democracy that incorporates and includes and integrates in the fullest sense of the term all of the different minorities, be they ethnic or religious or ideological, you don't have a functioning society. I mean, not at the political level. You will always have a stratified society. There will be no progress away from the kinds of marginalization that Israel, had in its early decades. I don't think there's any future for the country without Jewish-Arab partnership. In terms of the left in particular, I think that also holds. I think the left has been in crisis for many years. This is not a new, when journalists called me and said, like 2 weeks before the elections and said, I want to write a story about the decline of the left, I said, you are 20 years too late. Because for a long time, the left has stood for something in the eyes of Israelis, all Israelis, that had lost relevance. And that was, a kind of singular commitment in ending the occupation through a 2-state partition. There was no real understanding of what the left stood for other than that. And, there was always in the background, the consciousness that Meretz stood for a more liberal, open, progressive, set of values. And the irony was always that, a majority of Israelis agree with most of the positions that Meretz espouses on things, especially things like LGBT rights and gender equality and, and environmentalism and everything else. But the first thing that anybody beyond the Jewish Zionist, far left would say is about Meretz is, well, they're all very nice and good, but they're radical left. And what they meant by that was they support a two-state solution. So people, the left, whoever that means, whether it's political leaders, activists, op-ed writers, whoever, however you can think about the left, never managed to really recreate a vision that went beyond a singular issue, which is ending occupation, of course, one that I wholeheartedly embrace. They never went beyond a singular issue to develop a bigger worldview, or at least project that they were developing a bigger, broader worldview. And they never managed to carefully and I think thoughtfully update how they approach that singular issue. So as, again, some of you, if I don't see all the participants, I'm sure maybe Mark Baker is here, you asked me about this in an email, but I mean, I have long been critical of the traditional two-state solution based on a hard ethnic partition, which I think is essentially wrong for Israel. But that was a change of understanding that came, that I arrived at that after many years of trying to figure out what was wrong with the two-state solution and what would be a better way. And I think that much of the left is rooted to antiquated ideas that much of Israeli society genuinely sees as irrelevant. So I know that's a long kind of answer that diverged a little bit from your question, but I do think that the left is now, however it happened, has become conscious of a new theme in Israeli society, which is Jewish-Arab partnership. And it's very intuitive, it's very hopeful. It's something that many Israelis agree with, even if they are not from the left, including from the right, for reasons that may sound counterintuitive, but I think many right-wingers take pride in saying, we actually can accept our Arab minority. What we disagree on is, what should happen with the territories and who should own the land. And, that's a painful disagreement, but I think that they are sort of proud to prove that they have no ill intention towards Arab citizens. And I think that it was always a mistake of Gantz to try to run after the right by imitating Netanyahu, both in terms of trying to outdo him on security, but specifically in terms of trying to, insist that he was more anti-Arab than Netanyahu by refusing to talk to the Joint List again, especially because it was ridiculous. He opened negotiations with them after September. So his leadership, in answer to Yochai Glick, Gantz's leadership was really practically an empty shell. I mean, he's not a great campaigner. He doesn't have great charisma. He looks a little bit like Joe Biden and kind of being almost in control, but you always worry that he's going to kind of, mess up. But also, he refused to espouse any coherent worldview, ideology, principles. If I listened to him every day in my living room, so to speak, for a year, and I still don't know what he stands for. The platform is a little clearer, the written platform, but I have a feeling it wasn't written by him. And when he did take positions, it was primarily about replacing Netanyahu, being as tough as Netanyahu on security, being just like Netanyahu on annexation and wanting to annex the Jordan Valley, and being nastier than Netanyahu in terms of eventually deciding he was never going to even open negotiations with the Joint List after he had already done that in September. And there was no, then it was like practically absurd that in this campaign, they ran ads saying, we will revive the health system. I mean,
right.
yeah,
where
I
did
want
that come from?
the health system to revive, but it was completely disconnected from any sort of story. In one of another webinar that I did a couple of days ago, somebody said, what were the stories that each side was telling their voters? And I thought that was a very good question. Netanyahu's story has been very clear for a long time, but Gantz's story was no story. There just wasn't any narrative to it.
So how does that happen though? He's been running for prime minister for more than a year. How does it, and he's been the lead opposition candidate for more than a year. How has that not developed? How has that kind of been left to falter like that? It's kind of absurd in a way.
I wrote an article for 972 magazine after the April elections when I argued that generals are don't have any particular advantage in Israeli society, no matter how much the left thinks that it takes a general to salvage, the opposition. There's no particular advantage, and they don't do particularly well. We can look at the history of generals who've run for office, and some of them famously became good politicians, but only after spending a lot of time in politics. And all the many generals who didn't make it, we forget about them. it's like the coronavirus. You only hear how many died, but you don't know how many were sick and then got better, except the opposite. So this is like they fail, but we don't remember the percentage because they just fell out of our radar. Gantz had no political experience. I think he had less political experience than any other potential prime minister in Israeli history. In other words, zero. He had no political background before forming this party. He never served as a lawmaker. He never served as a minister. And so that put him at a very significant disadvantage. People in the party, the leadership, the cockpit, they know it. There was already grumbling from the start that he wasn't their best candidate. I think it's a little bit fashionable to criticize the leader and say so-and-so would have been better. I'm not sure if it's true, but there are many people who think that Gabi Ashkenazi would have been a stronger candidate. I don't know. He doesn't have political experience either. But then I guess part of it is also the campaign decisions. I don't know how they made those decisions. I knew the campaign manager when Gantz was still his own little party called Israeli Resilience. And I guess at least they had a message, but I don't know how their campaign made their decisions. It's clear that they had the right strategic diagnosis, that they needed to pull votes from the moderate right wing of the Likud. That is correct, but I think they went about it all wrong. And if you want to hear my 2 cents, since they didn't listen to me when I wrote this in articles, they should have been embracing, going on a full-out positive campaign to salvage the Israeli judiciary and the role of law and independent branches of government in a democracy. Because that is something that divides the moderate right from the ideological right and makes a significant portion of the right wing uncomfortable when Netanyahu, it goes on an onslaught against the police and the state prosecutor and the attorney general and the Supreme Court. And that's been happening for a decade. Netanyahu just got into the game in response to his indictments, but enough of the right wing is alienated by that and worried about that it could have pushed, exactly the small percentage he needed. And I never understood why the only politicians who talked about the role of the judiciary in Israeli society was the right wing, the far right, represented by Ayelet Shaked, promising to continue undermining the judiciary. That was, I think, one of the biggest failings of all the opposition parties throughout 2019. They had 3 election cycles to get it right. The prime candidates for getting it right should have been blue and white, and it was a catastrophic failure, in my opinion, that they didn't embrace this. So for some shameless self-promotion, you're welcome to read an article I just wrote in Haaretz English just before the election, where I touched on this in an analysis of Israeli public opinion around this issue.
Look, it's kind of, you kind of outlined all the reasons why it, all the things they could have done, but I still think, we just, apart from inexperience, we just won't know why it didn't happen. It just seems like, the data that you have, where the thing that differentiates the soft right from the hard right in Israel is a desire to protect Israeli democracy, which is kind of in our NIF world, that's our main frame, that's our main focus point, is how do we do this?
Well, don't give up on them. Don't give up on them. Here's the thing, is I think that it doesn't serve the left anymore to be sort of internal and sectoral and, with a kind of barricaded mentality, which developed for good reason during the Second Intifada. But I think this is not the time. If we can do Jewish-Arab partnership, we can do partnership with the center and with the moderate right, and anybody who can agree on some of the core principles, including when we don't agree on all of them. I also believe, I want to make one more point about this. The issue of democracy and salvaging the rule of law and strengthening the institutions of liberal democracy are not disconnected from the problem of annexation. They are part and parcel of it. I have a long report on this, but I'll just make the case. If you weaken the foundations of the Supreme Court and the ability of the court to rule laws as being unconstitutional, uphold the rights of people to, petition the court for human rights and civil rights violations, you strengthen the possibility of resisting the human rights violations that will invariably be the result of annexation. And I think that ultimately you strengthen the institutions that will help either prevent forms of annexation in the terms of direct petitions against such kinds of laws, but also, if that's what's going to happen, you ensure that there is an ability to protest the kinds of apartheid-like policies that will result.
It's also, I mean, another frame that we often, another thing we often repeat is that, democracy, human rights, these are not left-right concepts. These are kind of universal liberal concepts that, have been embedded or were embedded for a long time in the Israeli right that seem to have been eroded. Let's zoom in a little bit because it's a question that we've been, that a lot of our supporters have been talking about over the last couple of months, has been the very specific failure of Labor and Meretz, and this, shrinking from almost 30 seats just 5 years ago to now being 7. Was that, it was obviously a deliberate choice to amalgamate in order to make sure they crossed the threshold, but that seems to have failed miserably. I saw that one example also, obviously it's not just Labor and Meretz, it's also Getreu, a social justice oriented, maybe even right-wing party that kind of fits in, that merged with Labor in the last election in September. They also lost seats from when they ran on their own in April, from their core constituency, who think of themselves as, socioeconomic, but not leftist. And as soon as you put them together with Labor and Meretz, they lose votes. So
no, they didn't lose seats because they didn't cross the threshold.
No, as in they lost votes. I think like one example was in Beit Shan, where the number of people who voted for Getreu went down significantly from April when they ran alone to September when they ran with Labor, and then just now when they ran with both Labor and Meretz. So in hindsight, do you think that that was a good call for them to merge and work together, or would they have been better trying to kind of fight it out, being maybe even more authentically left, trying to appeal to that, particularly in Meretz's case, more of a Jewish-Arab partnership? What should they have done, and where can they go going forward?
I think that, let me give you the analysis of why they dropped, and then I'll tell you what my personal view. Sure. I think that we have to remember something very basic. When Yair Lapid established what was considered the center party at the time, Yesh Atid, even though it was generally seen as a center-left party, but there was no other center party, they sucked up Labor votes in 2013, and they did very well. And then when Labor became the Zionist Union and merged with Tzipi Livni, they sucked up Yair Lapid's votes. These parties traded votes. Now, Blue and White is seen as more centrist than Yesh Atid. So it's not really seen as center-left, although Netanyahu tries to make it look center-left for the right-wing voters. But essentially, the main draw, as you all know, of Blue and White was that it was supposed to be big enough and substantial enough to replace Netanyahu. And that has become the first priority of many people on the Zionist left. And so I think that yes, we can, before we start blaming whatever went wrong with the strategic decisions to merge, or what kind of campaign they ran. And I was no fan of Avi Gabay, trust me, the previous Labor leader. But I think before we even start assessing the impact of those things, we have to realize the basic structural feature. There are a limited number of Zionist left and centrist voters, and they all want Netanyahu out. That's what unites them. I think that it's not a personal hatred of Netanyahu, as the right wants to say it is. It is a genuine substantive opposition to the way he leads and what he stands for. I think it's also becoming a mindset that until he goes, we can't do anything that would advance a sort of progressive center left-wing agenda, whatever that means to Israeli voters. So first of all, we have to take that into account, that no matter who would be running in a centrist party, if it had the possibility of actually being the biggest party that could replace Netanyahu, it would have vacuumed up left-wing, much of the mainstream left-wing Jewish voters in Israel, no matter what. And as much as, again, I was critical of Avi Gabay and his form of leadership, I think the vast portion of the votes that vanished between 2015 and April 2019 is really about that. Now, what happened? Why did they lose votes? Why did they go from 10 to 7? Another contextual issue, even before I get into the strategic question. It was almost a rule of thumb in Israel that when parties merged, they generally came in, the results generally showed less as a merged party than the two parties would ever have separately. There were many examples of it, and only a few exceptions over time. So, the consultants used to always laugh about it. We all know that, I don't know how exactly to explain it, but it was kind of a rule of thumb. And so that doesn't surprise me either. Having said that, let me get into my analysis of why. Okay, so I explained why many Jewish left-wing Zionist voters moved to blue and white. Really, they started to see getting rid of Netanyahu as the first condition for everything else, and blue and white certainly was the biggest challenger party to do that. On the other hand, as I said, when I explained why Jews would vote for the joint list, some portion of them, and it may not have been exactly one seat's worth of votes, which would have been 35,000 people, but it was somewhere, may have been somewhere close to that, or a little bit less than that. It's hard, again, we're doing very slow tallies, but those people thought that it wasn't a strong enough statement against where, reacting to where Israeli society really is right now. And so it just wouldn't have been meaningful for them to vote for Labor and Meretz together. That's another reason why they left. And I think that beyond those things, I personally, as a consultant, as a campaign strategist, never understood how we can appeal, how anybody should expect to appeal to voters based on the idea of saving the party. I agree with Tzipi Livni on this. The party is a vessel. It should not have any meaning in itself. If it doesn't stand for something, if it doesn't provide either a political path forward or an ideological path forward, it has no particular need to exist. And when people talk about how sad it is that Labor has collapsed, I don't think it's sad. If Labor doesn't stand for anything, if Labor can't really espouse a cohesive ideology, then it doesn't matter. Having said all that, okay, I commend Amir Peretz and even Orly Levy, though I would never have voted for her because she comes from the right, she supported the nation state law. I commend them for trying time after time to move the agenda of the elections in Israel to social and economic welfare issues. We need them desperately. We if anybody hasn't read this, there was a very, I think a stunning article in the New York Times maybe the day before the elections, talking about how Israel, for all of its image as a startup nation, is facing very severe crises in infrastructure, health, education, and the results are showing it. It's not a matter of what might happen. We live this day to day, and we just can never tear ourselves away from the idea of voting based on security and peace, all of which are important, but our daily reality is being sacrificed for those things. And I do think that there's a need for what they tried to do. It's a little bit sad that it didn't come together in a more genuine way in terms of their campaign, but I think they also face a very deep structural problem in Israeli society trying to appeal to people based on that. It's just one of those, very, very deeply rooted contradictions, which is something that Meretz faced all along. Like I said, a majority of Israelis, if you poll them, agree on the majority of the kinds of social issues that Meretz advances, but just views them as left-wing. And in this case, it wasn't even so much that Labor Meretz Gesher was viewed as left-wing, although it was, but more that the sense of whether you're for or against Netanyahu became more important, symbolizing more things and symbolizing the conditions that Israel needs in order to do anything else, both for and against, than the luxury of voting for a party that only deals with daily life issues.
One of the, probably the main decision maker over the next few weeks of coalition building will be Avigdor Lieberman, who faces, excuse me, an interesting choice between either giving his blessing to Netanyahu, which he's sworn against, or giving his blessing to including from outside the government the acceptance of the confidence vote from the joint list, or trying to push to get, he also obviously may not be involved if there is a unity government between just Likud and blue and white. He kind of has to break a promise. He has to, which is certainly not outside of his historical political experience. Which direction do you think he will go? Which base will he try and shore up? And what's his price? Is it that he will have to, if he's going to be lured back by Netanyahu, is it that he has to be a rotating prime minister? Is that the kind of price he will ask for? What is it that you think that he will want?
There's been a little bit of radio silence from the Lieberman camp. We don't really know at this point. There's been speculation about this all year. I thought after the April election that his obvious price would be either being a very high minister or a rotation of prime minister. And I thought it was a shoo-in that when he got one of these things, he would go right into the government. None of us expected him to take this big stand against going into a Netanyahu government. And very few of us actually believed that it was all about the draft law. The draft law seemed like a flimsy excuse for simply blocking Netanyahu from forming the next government. That's what he is constantly perceived as representing right now. Is everybody who knows him tells me he is committed to taking Netanyahu down, to preventing a Netanyahu-led government. He has said he won't go into a Netanyahu-led government right now, but he doesn't always say that. And if you look at his actual statements, it's not always clear that he would, never go into such a government if maybe he got the right things. But the rest is speculation because it will depend on, his own internal calculations. I think that nobody would really punish him for going into a government. I think that breaking coalition promises, it's not just him. Everybody will have to break coalition promises if there is to be a coalition at all.
Right.
And that's normal. We were used to that in Israeli society. 2019 was the outlier. It's like, great, now you decided to all start keeping your promises.
Right.
At our, emotional, political, and financial expense. Thanks.
Yeah.
So I don't mind it. I don't think anybody would care. And we hear people say this all the time, public figures, saying, fine, break your promises already, just so we don't have to go into third. But again, anybody will have to. I mean, blue and white, if they split into factions in order to help form a government, that will be a broken promise. If Gantz goes into such a government, that will be a broken promise. If Labor goes into a Netanyahu-led government, that will be a broken promise. And if the opposition parties manage to do something, that will be a broken promise in terms of their boycott against the joint list, because even if they don't bring it into government, they will depend on it for that one vote of confidence. So it's hard to say what Lieberman's price would be. I imagine that if he is going to break the promise of not going into a Netanyahu-led government, at least he will demand some sort of technical restrictions on Netanyahu's ability to be prime minister. Maybe something like reviving the president's proposal from last time, which would have Netanyahu be a sort of acting prime minister in name, but not on active duty while he's on trial, or something like that. Something that limits Netanyahu's actual, de facto role as prime minister while he's under trial. But that seems far-fetched because Netanyahu, has resisted that all along, tooth and nail, although he did indicate openness to the president's proposal, but we don't know how serious he is. So I can't say I've heard any new rumors about Lieberman's actual price for going back into the right. And in terms of the ability to go into a center-left coalition, well, a minority coalition, again, he could do that, and it would mean, depending on the joint list for the vote of confidence, to elect such a, to support such a minority government, which at the very least would not be breaking the promise of the kind of government he would sit in. But it's hard to see that happening at this point for the reasons I said before. I think the first most likely option is that Netanyahu will be given the task of forming a government. I could be wrong about this. Nobody's really sure. So
it seems like everyone who thought, there's no chance we'll go to a second election, there's no chance we'll go to a third election.
Right.
So I think this really has kind of confounded everybody. I want to ask you, we've only got a few minutes left, and I do want to ask you about annexation, and because that does seem to be a real looming threat to both the human rights of Palestinians living in the occupied territories, but also to Israel's core democratic principles. But before, I kind of want to end on that, because I'm hoping that will be a kind of way forward. The next question, though, I think is about a fourth election. And do you think, everyone predicted that this would have lower turnout, both because of lethargy from now a third election, and also people thought that there would be a lower turnout because of the coronavirus, and everyone would be scared to go in public and kind of share germs with each other in polling stations. I found it interesting that actually of the isolated polling booths of those with coronavirus, they swung to the left. And I think that the left-wing parties, or at least the non-Bibi camp, seem to do a lot better than the Bibi camp. So I don't know what that says about, in the Israeli case, mainly people have returned from northern Italy, I guess. What does happen? If you had to either put a percentage on it or you put it as the least likely option, but I also feel like it's going to be constantly looming. Will the people ever revolt and say a fourth election is totally unacceptable to us? Like you said, I don't care if you go back on your on your views, on your promises. Just get it done.
There's no way to predict whether there'll be a fourth election, but I think that the public pressure to avoid a fourth election will be enormous. And not just, when I say public, I don't just mean the public. I mean, opinion leaders, op-ed, again, like opinion writers, civil society leaders, other political figures, mayors, that kind of thing. I think that we will see a lot of pressure to avoid a fourth election. And if there is a fourth election, I'm not sure, unless the party structure changes dramatically. Listen, if there is a fourth election, I can say the following. I think that probably Gantz will be replaced, maybe by Ashkenazi.
That's interesting.
Unless the party system changes, unless there are really significantly different kinds of parties, I don't understand why we can expect any different results. I mean, we added, from what I heard, a report that Israel, from April, I think, to now, added 60,000 new voters, people who turned 18, some of my friends' kids, and it didn't change anything, which is interesting in itself, considering young people are more right-wing, but something, but still, I don't see why the results would be different unless there is a major difference in the party structures themselves. And, to that extent, I don't think the parties want to take another chance on this if they can possibly avoid it. Likud, hopefully has been a little bit chastened by what happened in 2019, in which they could not get 61 seats at any point without Lieberman. 3 elections in a row. How many do you need to prove that? And so I'm not sure why the Likud would take this chance again, especially when it's clear that the right wing ideologically is a little bit stagnant in the voting results. And the only party, as everybody's kind of noticing, the only party that might have an interest and is on an upward trend is the joint list. Yeah. And by the way, if Netanyahu keeps up what he said yesterday, I can guarantee you the result for the joint list will rise. But obviously Labor and Meretz don't want it, but they won't have much of a say. Lieberman is not doing any stunning results. He gained 3 seats once, but then plateaued and went down to 7 seats in the current election.
Well, the second election was really about him. It was about his... kind of principled stand, even though it may not have been so principled, but that's how he kind of sold it, and he did well, but he receded.
Right, he receded a little bit, and I think that what he did in September was essentially get the votes of people who were committed right-wingers, some of them Likudnikim, not all, but some, and Kahlon voters, and people who said, we're on the right, we're firmly on the right, but we're ready to be done with Netanyahu. And that novelty wore off a little bit, for some of them. And I think that not just the novelty wore off, but people realized that if he has too much power, the blocks aren't big enough and there can't be a government. So let's vote for the bigger parties, which I think was the logic of many people. Certainly there were many arguments in the media saying, the only way to avoid a fourth election is to vote for the big parties. But even that is not truly logical because it's all about the size of the blocks, so the big parties.
Shifting seats between doesn't really change much.
And there has been very little shifting between the blocks. That's really the issue in a way.
Which is why, like you said, the growth of the joint list is in some ways the most important, because that is growth of a bloc, of the Arab bloc that maybe has the capacity to grow that kind of centre-left Arab bloc more than at the expense of the right wing. But even then, not really.
Except that it didn't really, because it pretty much just took, it had to do with Arab turnout. It took from, Labor Meretz. Some of the people went there. Again, probably not even, maybe just 1 seat or just, near 1 seat. But the center and left bloc, well, it depends on whether you consider them a bloc as center, left, and Arab or not.
Right.
But they didn't do that differently from the previous elections, ultimately. In the final calculation, because Blue and White only got 33 and Meretz only got 7.
Okay, so we're going to wrap just with this last question as we hit about the 1 hour mark, which is about annexation. Annexation was a big thing that Netanyahu was pushing after the Trump plan was released. He was pushing for annexation to happen before the election. In the end, I think it was mainly because of pressure from the Trump administration that was pushed off. There seemed to be a miscommunication between the Americans and the Israelis about when exactly that would be allowed. The Blue and White Party.
Embarrassing, isn't it?
A little bit embarrassing when the plan that you kind of drafted, or at least were lead in drafting, then kind of didn't go your way in the end.
Totally.
The Blue and White Party seems to be broadly in favour of annexation, but they've kind of added a bit of an asterisk maybe that says we'll only do it under international consensus or with some kind of international flavour. It does have the...
That's an oxymoron.
Right, probably.
You know, annexation is unilateral conquering of territory.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, maybe that's, you know, the way that they kind of get around not doing it. But what is the, given it has the capacity to make such a substantive impact on the ground, mainly for Palestinians in the occupied territories, is that something that during the coalition negotiations will be front and center as a bargaining tool, or also as a reality? Many would say that creeping annexation is already a reality on the ground, but many some kind of
say it, but
many would.
But it's practically not a matter of what people say. It's right. I mean, I think even especially right wingers who are settlers, and left wingers do not disagree on that. That there has been de facto creeping annexation, you know, for decades, but especially over the last 10 years. So
then, what does that become front and center in the coalition negotiations? Is that?
I mean, I think so. I think Netanyahu has been a classic case of being dragged along by his campaign. In other words, most people agree that he's not a super ideological, messianic, you know, visionary for de jure annexation. He wants Israel to have territorial maximalism, but he never was like this great proponent of we must declare sovereignty, because he's well aware of how the global system works and how the post-World War II order, you know, views that. And he does not want to face, I think he is a manipulator and maneuverer of Israel's relations with the international system. So, but he roped himself into this by, you know, with his decisions to campaign by throwing red meat, as he has once put it himself, to the right wing, and promising annexation first in April, then in September, and then showing, you know, revealing his plan for annexing the Jordan Valley, and then the Trump plan and the insistence that he will start annexation immediately. And having done that, he dragged the other right-wing parties along with him. Well, the right-wing parties were already there, but I think that they started to like really see it happening, and it kind of opened up an appetite, or deepened the appetite, I should say, for making it a reality. So at this point, he has become a prisoner of his campaign. I think that it will be part of the negotiation over the next coalition government, because think about this scenario, which dawned on me yesterday. Let's say Blue and White says, you know what, time to put this whole thing to rest. We have to find our way into a unity government, or parts of Blue and White, maybe just Benny Gantz's party. Their first demand, their toughest demand, so they're not seeing as betraying every principle in the world, will be for limitations on Netanyahu's term as prime minister. And to get Netanyahu to agree on that, they will probably be prepared to give in on the issue of annexation, which, as you point out, is not even giving in, because they support annexation of the settlement blocks and the Jordan Valley. So I have a feeling that we're on a path towards it. Even if politicians wanted to stop it at this point, they've created their own monster, and they are beholden to the further right. They are locked into positions they've stated, and even the sort of game theory analysis leads to this being more and more of a realistic part. However, I don't think it will happen in the form of what I call the dramatic annexations. I don't think we're going to see annexation of the Jordan Valley or Area C over the next number of months. I think that probably they will, because both Netanyahu and Gantz are probably a little bit reluctant to go full out, I think that they will probably try to appease the sort of general zeitgeist, moving in that direction by advancing piecemeal forms of annexation, even more piecemeal than just the Jordan Valley, including bills to annex something like Ma'ale Adumim, or continue building in E1, or things that kind of satisfy the annexationist direction and are extremely meaningful, but are not as dramatic as full-out annexation. And the result of that is not good. It means there's less of a concrete violation for the world to respond to. And as we've seen over the years, is just as likely to lead to a situation where the international community lets Israel get away with that. And I've argued that the international community should start to recognize de facto forms of annexation and creeping annexation for what it is, and find ways to take punitive measures against that justifiably and consistently in other countries as well. Otherwise, the countries that want to do this kind of thing have a very easy way out of avoiding the prohibition on conquering territory by force.
Look, we'll leave it there. I think on the annexation question, this is obviously something that NIF is very preoccupied with, and something that we'll continue to make sure that the rights of Palestinians in the occupied territories are upheld, that we ultimately work to end the occupation and achieve a two-state outcome. That's the way forward. Short of the ballot box being able to resolve some of these questions, certainly civil society will play a leading role in that, through litigation, through kind of person-to-person contact, through all of these different tools that civil society has at their disposal. And that's the NIF tool, is to try and improve the lives of people on the ground, particularly while the political class are kind of unable to get done what they need to do. So I will say thank you to everyone who's joined at home on this Thursday night, sorry. Thank you very much to Dahlia for joining us from Tel Aviv. Thank you to Sharon Burge, our program manager, for helping facilitate the whole evening. And I'm sure we'll be in touch with you all soon. Thanks so much and have a good night.
Thank you for having me.
Interesting.